Hello, and welcome to my final project for digital game culture. Today, I will be talking about the video game known as Earthbound. I will be discussing its narrative and determining its artistic merit. I will also discuss controversies surrounding most video games today, and seeing if Earthbound has any of those issues. And finally, I will also bring up the subject of games as art, and if games are, for lack of better terms, important. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Part A, Earthbound's narrative. The game begins by giving you the option to name each of the characters. You also get to name the main character's pet, and the game asks you for your favorite food and what you think the coolest thing is. In my playthrough, I named the characters Peter, Katie, Ben, and Ezra, respectively. However, the default names happen to be Ness, Paula, Jeff, and Poe. I also named the dog Deacon, and put my favorite food as pizza. The story begins with a meteorite crashing on Earth. Ness, the main hero of the game, naturally wants to go investigate. After some antics involving the police, you end up going in order to save Pokey's younger brother. When you investigate the meteorite, a strange time-traveling bee tells you that an evil alien known as Gygas has taken over in the future, and you need to stop him. The bee, named Buzz, is killed by Pokey's mother. Let us take note how much of an annoying jerk Pokey and his entire family is. It actually becomes important later. As he is dying, the bee gives you an item called the Soundstone, and instructs you to go to each your sanctuary location and record the melody that plays there. This is when your journey begins. After a quick rest at your home, you set off into town. Here is where Earthbound begins to get interesting. Like a lot of RPG games, Earthbound doesn't have any linear levels or hub worlds. Unlike a lot of RPGs, however, its emphasis isn't on dungeons. Instead, the level of progression is more based around where you are in the story. This is because Earthbound is filled with subplots. Each subplot is unique, but at the same time follows a certain kind of formula. In every town or in every situation, something is either off or something is blocking your way. The cause is typically some sort of evil monster or person being influenced by Gygas. Only by defeating the monster or person can you progress. Other than fighting, Earthbound is also filled with lots of puzzles. Sometimes getting to a boss or even being able to fight a boss requires some sort of unique object. How you require that unique object is different in almost every situation. Typically, you can get the item that is required by talking to someone. While all these subplots are going on, you may need to remind yourself to collect the melodies at your sanctuary locations. Most of the time, the game will let you pass right by them, even though they're required at the end of the game. Along your journey, you meet each character destined to help Ness on his journey. These are the characters we named at the beginning of the game. We meet Paula at Tucson, where we have to save her from the Happy cult. We meet Jeff and Threed, where he saves us from the dungeon Belch's zombies put us in. And Poe joins you after you eat some magic cake. There are also some minor recurring characters that help you along the way, such as Jeff's dad, Dr. Andonuts, who helps the group with his ridiculous inventions and a flying ship, Apple Kid, a kid inventor who helps the group by giving his ridiculous inventions, the Runaway Five, a band that Ness has to constantly bail out of debts, and most importantly, Pokey, your neighborhood jerk who has gotten himself invested with the bad guys multiple times. After you collect all 8 melodies, you unlock the path to your world, a place that seems to be Ness's own dream world, located inside Ness's mind. The dream world is known as Magicance. Here, he defeats the dark parts of his mind and unlocks an incredible power using the Soundstone. Ness and his party must go and fight Gygas, traveling in time to a point where he is most weakest. When you get to Gygest, it is revealed how much Pokey is involved. He is actually working right side with Gygas. The battle with Gygas is pretty powerful. Not only has the build-up been pretty big, but the tone of the battle alone is pretty creepy. Gygas' appearance is completely distorted, and the notifications you get regarding attacks say things like, you're not able to comprehend his attack. The whole battle is designed to make you feel hopeless. The only way to defeat Gygas is by using Paula's attack, Prey. Prey typically is a random attack. It's the kind of trump card you want to use as a last resort, because you don't know what the effects are. However, in Gygas' battle, it is the only way you can win. Once you successfully defeat Gygas, you're teleported back to the present. There, everyone parts ways and goes back home.
Part B. Controversy.
Now, we will talk about some of the popular controversial issues surrounding video games. This includes violence, sexuality, and justification of violence, sexuality, and gender roles. First, let's talk about violence. In my mind, Earthbound is violent, but not the kind of violent everyone is overly worried about. There is no blood or gore, the enemies just flash when they are hit. This is something that many people refer to as cartoon violence. The attacks are still called bash and shoot, but since this is a kid's game, it chooses to convey that you are defeating enemies rather than killing them. At first, this bothered me a little bit, but after thinking about it, these enemies who are being controlled by Gygas are coming after me. This is self-defense. And I think the biggest defense for Earthbound on this is that you don't actually kill anyone except for monsters that are obviously alien, like Belch. The animals become tame, the people turn normal, and any moving inanimate objects simply stop moving. Next on the controversials list is sexuality. Nintendo is a company that doesn't make a lot of games with tons of sexuality in it. They're pretty PG. However, in Earthbound, there is a surprising amount of innuendos. However, most of the time, the innuendos are pretty subtle, and they usually don't imply anything too risque. On the subject of gender roles, I feel the game does pretty well. There might be some who disagree with me, but I think they should consider the fact that this was made in the 90s. Those who view Paula as filling the role of damsel in distress probably haven't passed the part of rescuing her. Because once she joins your party, and once she levels up quite a bit, she actually becomes a force to be reckoned with. Not to mention, she's the only party member who has the move Prey, which is vital in defeating Gygas at the very end. Part C. Potential Artistic Merit. Question 1. Does the game's design build in moments of contemplation? The structure of Earthbound seems to be pretty minimalistic and simple. It takes inspiration from turn-based RPGs. Instead of being an action game where you actively fight each enemy, you decide before each round what you want each character to do. Not only does this make Earthbound more fun for strategic players who don't have quick reactions, but it also forces you to think. There's also a ton of puzzles in Earthbound, all of them directly pertaining to the story. Whenever you enter a town, one of the biggest challenges presented is figuring out what to do next. This can be learned by talking to some of the local residents. Not only that, but what the residents say can also be quite comical. The game encourages you to play in a more of an explorative way. The game lets you do things like miss mandatory items that is necessary to complete the game. What I like about this is it feels like you're in control of part of the story. It doesn't just feel like you're playing a game or completing a challenge. This is where I believe moments of contemplation can occur. When you feel as it is you who is going through the story, and not some on-screen characters. I guess the game design doesn't so much have moments of contemplation built into it, rather it allows them to happen. Question 2. Does the game's narrative and gameplay design engage the player on an emotional level? I may be a little biased on this, but I think Earthbound does a really good job of this. Most of the time, Earthbound likes to be lighthearted, quirky, and weird. but that doesn't mean it won't sometimes play with your emotions. Especially in the ending scene with Gygas. The final battle isn't designed to be fun in a challenging or gameplay way, rather more in an emotional way. In order to beat Gygas, you have to use Paula's attack Prey, and as you do, everyone you have met on your journey begins to pray for you, lending you their strength to help defeat Gygas. Even if you didn't grow some sort of attachment to the characters as you progress through the story, in my opinion, that kind of ending makes you feel at least something for them. Question 3. Does the narrative or gameplay design communicate significant meaning about the human condition? What I like about Earthbound's story is that it's simply a story. It's not trying to convey any bigger meaning than that. That is not to say that one cannot take away meaning from it. In fact, in my opinion, a good story is one that doesn't feel like it's trying to push its own meaning onto you. I'm not the type of person that will usually tear apart a story and try to find out what everything means. But during this project, I find myself doing just that with Earthbound. Its quirkiness is overshadowed by its dark undertones. Even though you could consider the plot to be pretty simple, even if it is extremely different than most other RPGs, and even though I'm sure you could simply boil it down to a typical hero's story, there's a reason why these kind of stories are popular. I feel as though Earthbound can reflect the human condition the same way that popular books such as Lord of the Rings, or even old European folktales. Part D. Do games matter? I think the answer to this question is yes. However, that is not my answer to whether or not games can be considered art. I feel as though people are putting too big of an emphasis on whether or not games are art. One reason being, what one may consider art is different for each person. And secondly, I believe it does not matter whether or not games are art for games to matter. This could be because I never truly understood the appeal of art. If a great piece of art represents itself to me, I will thoroughly enjoy it and appreciate it. However, there may be something that a lot of people consider art that I find no value in. So, in my case, I don't feel as though I need to justify my time spent playing video games with whether or not it's art. In fact, I don't think anyone needs to justify their time spent playing games. Unless you play them so much it gets in the way of your social life or work life, then I don't see any problem with how anybody spends their own time. To me, video games are a form of entertainment, which means they make people happy. And if playing video games makes you happy, then why not play video games? Now, let us get to the real part of the discussion, judging whether or not games matter in the art world. For this discussion, I will be using questions Tom Bissell brings up in his book, Extra Lives. Part 1. What makes games good? What makes games bad? In Chapter 2 of Tom Bissell's book, he talks about the Resident Evil series and what he enjoyed about it. Particularly how the controls and the mechanics of the game work together to create a creepy and scary game feel. However, he goes on to talk about how ridiculous the actual story of the game is. He concludes the chapter with saying that Resident Evil shows how games can be good, but also how games could be bad. This is one of the explanations that Bissell gives to explain why video games are having trouble becoming a relevant cultural practice. Especially since gamers will latch onto what makes games good, and non-gamers will often focus on what makes games ridiculous. While I agree, this is why many non-gamers have trouble getting into games or viewing games as having any value, I think I disagree with Bissell when he asserts that the problem is gamers and game designers when they accept anything that is below perfect. Especially when whether or not a game is good or bad is completely subjective. For example, I'm unsure how Tom Bissell would feel about Earthbound. I believe the game is good all around, but I can see how one might be turned off by the childish and quirky nature of the game. For me, the childishness and quirkiness is what brought me into the game in the first place, but it was the adult undertones that make the game memorable. Part 2. The issue with over-explanation. In Chapter 3 of Tom Bissell's book, as he's trying to find out the purpose story serves in video games, he starts to begin to describe the issue of how gamers view story. He seems to believe that many gamers think more explanation is what makes a good story. So he points out that more often than not, more explanation actually ruins a story. He calls this the midi-chlorian error in a reference to the Star Wars prequels. This was his main problem with Resident Evil. To him, the game went to great lengths to explain what was going on and why there were suddenly zombies. Contrasts this game experience with another game he feels does not make this error, Valve's Left 4 Dead series. I agree with Bissell's point that stories can often be ruined by over-explanation. And while I have never played the Left 4 Dead series, I have played many of other Valve's games. Valve's other series, Half-Life and Portal, are also known to have great stories. Instead of offering a solid explanation to what's happening or why you're in this particular situation, Valve games often leave it up to the player to interpret their own meaning. While Earthbound does offer some sort of explanation to what's going on and why things are happening, to me it doesn't do it in a way that seems ridiculous. Some may find the idea of an all-powerful evil entity to be a bit cliché, but in my opinion, I feel as though the rest of the game makes up for this. And even when the game does offer ridiculous explanations for certain game mechanics, the fact that Earthbound doesn't take itself too seriously helps me not only accept the weird explanations, but also love it at the same time. Part 3. Video Game Characters. In Chapter 5 of Tom Bissell's book, he describes the issue most video games have with character. First, he explains that most main characters are made to look like their intended audience. This is why so many video game characters are male and are between the ages of 20 and 35. Secondly, he explains that most game designers seem to think that a more realistic character means having a more realistic look. Bissell's first point seems to be that video game characters need more variation. I agree that more variation is a good thing. The only thing I'm worried about is token characters being created just so each game could fill some sort of status quo on characters. Bissell's second point seems to be that a realistic character doesn't just mean a realistic look. In my gameplay of Earthbound, I find that to be very true. Earthbound was originally made on the Super Nintendo system, which means it had much more system limitations than most video games do today. However, in my opinion, the game itself and the characters are still really good, even by today's standards. That's because the character design didn't rely on graphics. Most of them are static images or pixelated characters with minimal animation. What makes them great is their dialogue. To me, a more realistic character wouldn't be one who looks more like a human being. Rather, they're characters that have believable personalities, that react believably to the situation around them or the things I say to them. I believe game designers should worry more about the character's personality than the actual character's look. Even games with silent protagonists can give their main characters great personalities without relying too much on their looks. Part 4. Giving the player choice. In Chapter 7, Bissell brings up Mass Effect, a popular RPG, most notable for its complicated story and alternate endings. Earlier in the book, Tom Bissell noted that he wanted games to tell him a story. What he didn't want were games to allow him to make a story, because after all, if he wanted to write his own story, he might as well just write his own story. This seems to contradict his love for Mass Effect. The difference is, Mass Effect didn't make you feel like you were writing your own story. Instead, it made you feel like you're creating your own path. One thing that Bissell noted is that when he watched other people play Mass Effect, he felt as though that they were playing as a different character. Part of this is because you get to edit your own character at the beginning of the game. But another part is that there are many points throughout the game where you make your own decisions. Instead of having a linear path, Mass Effects let you choose your character's reaction, letting you branch out on your own kind of story without making it seem like you're simply creating your own. Bissell seems to praise this feature of gameplay, and seems to assert that this is one way video games can differentiate themselves from other media. And I agree. Personally, I love games that have multiple endings, or allow me to choose my own reaction. However, Earthbound doesn't have multiple endings, and anytime you're allowed to react to a character's dialogue, Typically, it doesn't have any consequence on the story. However, I think Earthbound has its own ways of making the player feel like the story is their own. For instance, like I've said during Part A, one is able to completely miss most of your sanctuary locations, and while missing them simply means that you'll have to go back and go for them near the end of the game, I feel that this feature kind of draws me into the game just a little bit more. Another thing I like about the game is the seemingly lack of cutscenes. And lastly, except for the occasional hint mo or hint stand, for the most part, you're never directly told what to do. The levels aren't linear, and the only way you can figure out what to do next is by talking with people. Which means I will be developing my own reasons for going somewhere, instead of the game telling me why I'm going somewhere. Part 5. Unscripted Events in Video Games. In Chapter 8 of Tom Bissell's book, he talks about the game series known as Far Cry, and uses it as a leading example on how powerful unscripted events in video games can be. In Bissell's mind, what Far Cry explores is the savagery and chaos that ensues in violent situations such as a civil war. It doesn't explore why wars occur or why people engage in violent behavior. It instead focuses on the behavior and emotional consequences of being exposed to the violence. While you are walking around Far Cry, you can be jumped at any minute. Unlike in most video games, there aren't that many safe spots where you're free from enemy attack. And unlike a lot of games, most of the time events occur unscripted. Not only does this mean you can play the same area multiple times with different results, you have the chance of seeing something that you've never seen before, even if you have watched a billion playthroughs. I think I enjoy Earthbound's scripted moments more than I do its unscripted moments. That's not to say I would prefer if the whole thing was scripted, and I can certainly see the appeal of a video game like Far Cry having tons of unscripted events. And I do agree with Bissell, and I do think that these unscripted events is what separates video games from other narrative. Part 6. Conclusion. Within the first chapter of his book, Tom Bissell begins to question why certain games were considered good when they had plots that would be considered terrible in any other medium. Throughout his entire book, he explores this question, looking at aspects of games that he considers bad and aspects of games he considers good. I feel as though throughout the entire book, he makes some interesting points. By the end of the book, he's still exploring the question and hasn't found a real answer. In my opinion, the reason people can enjoy games with ridiculous plots is because the game is about experience. Even the most story-driven games need to be more focused on the player's experience if they want to be popular. This is why games like Resident Evil is so popular. Its focus isn't on a realistic scenario regarding zombies. Its focus is on making the player scared. I enjoyed my experience with Earthbound, not because of its quirky story, even though I enjoyed it a lot. I enjoyed Earthbound because I felt like I was going on an adventure. It feels great to be a young kid with psychic powers, trying to save the world. Tom Bissell may regard that desire to be childish, but I think it's what makes video games great.